Let's shift gears now to another worrying story. As politicians continue to play musical chairs in most metros in the country, residents are left frustrated by worsening service delivery. 6 metros have lost their mayors, leaving only Cape Town and eThekwini unscathed. Crumbling coalitions come at a cost for residents as they threaten the metro's budget approval. The Third Republic's latest MetroMonitor report indicates this political instability has dire consequences for service delivery. For more on this, I am joined by Paul Berkowitz from the Third Republic. Thank you so much for your time, Paul. We do appreciate it. I could say that the latest example is what we are seeing playing out in Hammanskraal, where you are seeing 29 people losing their lives because of the cholera outbreak and because the Rooiwal Water Waste project was never completed or upgraded, or whatever the case is in that particular water waste plant. There are obviously dire consequences to this musical chairs that we keep seeing, because we saw this coalition crumbling in the city of Tshwane. Maybe just tell us more in terms of what you are finding in these reports with regards to coalitions having a real impact on service delivery.
Thanks, Heidi. We started the project after the November 2021 election, so we've been monitoring on a daily basis the political and economic and service delivery events across the 8 metros for almost a year and a half. And what we've noticed is the political risk has increased, first gradually and now quite dramatically over the last 6 to 9 months. And we're starting to see, particularly from the last quarter of 2022 until the present, that the cumulative effect on service delivery and the financial health of the municipalities is taking a very real hit. Now, it's not consistent across the metros. For example, eKuruleni has consistently maintained clean audits and has run quite a tight fiscal ship, even though there have been different coalitions and there have been mayors coming in and out. But in places like Johannesburg, in Tshwane, which you mentioned, in eThekwini, and in places like Nelson Mandela Bay, the musical chairs is having a very real effect. A lot of council time is being taken up with motions of no confidence. In Johannesburg in particular, we know this as Johannesburg residents, but to recap for everybody else, there's something like 15, 16, 17 parties, very complicated coalitions. And we've seen a phenomenon in Johannesburg and in eKuruleni that where the ANC and the EFF coalition partners can't agree between themselves who should be a mayor, they're electing mayors from very small parties. So we've had an eKuruleni mayor from the African Independent Congress, we had a Tshwane mayor from COPE, both one-seat parties, and we've now on our second Al Jamaa mayor, and if you look in today's Sunday Times, he's being investigated. He's under a cloud of suspicion for fraud and some pyramid scheme that he's been running for a few years.
Very worrying. I want to speak about the underspending of budgets in these municipalities or in these metros, because we've often seen with these coalitions, when a new mayor comes in, they attack the previous administration. They speak about how there was either underspending, money wasn't used properly or efficiently, or money was basically stolen, which becomes very worrying, because if you look at, for example, in the city of Johannesburg, it's crumbling. The roads are in a complete state. Street lights don't work. You know, we have many problems, water challenges, electricity challenges, substations not operating the way they should. What are you finding in terms of budgets being underspent, or these coalitions blaming each other for money not being used adequately?
Well, underspending of budgets, Heidi, particularly capital budgets, it's not a new phenomenon. It's not something that we can pinpoint and say this is 100% the fault of shifting coalitions and shaky partnerships. For example, if we look at eThekwini, I think what's been in the news for weeks now, if not months, is huge underspending of capital budgets, particularly the flood relief budgets that have been granted to the Metro and the rest of the KZN province after the floods last year. And that is partly down to maladministration and corruption. And it sometimes is down to a lack of capacity, a lack of project management, not having the skills within a municipality to run complicated capital budgets. That shouldn't be the case with the metros. Now, back to Johannesburg, and unfortunately, we're an example for all the wrong reasons. What we started to see from October, November last year, when the DA Action SA-led coalition, the so-called multi-party coalition, was still in control, and the mayor was still Mpho Phalatse from the DA, is that the coalition was motivating for a 2 billion rand loan from the Development Bank of Southern Africa. This was a short-term loan, a bridging loan. We'd known for a while that the Metro was having cash flow issues related to things like collection rates and billing not being high enough and expenses being higher than expected. That loan was held up by the ANC, the EFF, by the Patriotic Alliance. Meanwhile, a whole number of problems were being manifest. The city couldn't pay for the renewal of its vehicle fleet. So I think Avis, who was the service provider, recalled 400 vehicles. These were vehicles that were used by departments, including the emergency medical services. So you can imagine what that kind of effect would have if you can't run your emergency medical services because you don't have money. In December, the loan still not having been passed, the finance department of the city was evicted from their offices because rent hadn't been paid for 8 months. Now, it was common cause that there were problems, there were financial cash flow problems in the city, but the loan was still not passed. In February, when Tapelo Ahmed, the first Al Jamaa mayor, was elected, one of the first things he did, well, his administration, was approve the loan. Now, there were problems approving the loan so late in the year, close to the adjustment budget, but the excuse that the ANC, the EFF, the Patriotic Alliance, Al Jamaa, Good, the ATM, the AIC, and other parties in the ANC-EFF coalition gave is that the DA didn't inform the council, well, the DA-led coalition didn't inform the council of how bad the financial situation was. All of these councillors should have access to monthly management accounts. They should all have access to the quarterly Section 71 statements. It is a bald-faced lie to say they didn't know how bad the situation was, but because they're playing politics, the city's now in a dire financial situation.
But that's the thing here, Paul, is that we are constantly told, oh, we didn't know, we had no idea, the situation is far worse than we thought. But you, a councillor, you should be having access to this information. You know, for example, the parties that are part of the majority coalition. I wanted to ask you what the way is forward, because you know, as a citizen or a resident, you look at this mess and you go, is it ever going to get better? When are my potholes ever going to get fixed? Driving home, there are no street lights. There are serious water cuts now. We've been told about the city of Johannesburg not being so dependent on Eskom, but how does that even happen when our substations can't cope with the constant on and off of load shedding? There's just so many problems, the list is endless. But is there a solution to this, or are we just going to keep being affected by the politics at play here?
Well, Heidi, the bad news is there's no silver bullet and there's no solution in the short term. The good news is there are a number of initiatives that might make a difference and might bring about the change and stability we need. There's a bill, I think, introduced by the DA, but supported by the ANC and other big parties, to introduce a representation threshold at local government level. What this would mean practically is that a party would need at least 1% of the vote to have representation in council. So quick advert for our work. We'll be bringing out an article this week or next looking at that scenario, what would happen. Bad news, it doesn't, as far as we can see, change the status quo in most of the metros for now, but it should introduce more stability and more accountability. There'd be fewer, bigger parties, and they wouldn't have anywhere to hide behind 1 and 2 councillor parties that they can use as figureheads and puppets. The other thing is that the non-profit sector, the civil society sector, a lot of our partners are picking up the slack where our elected officials are letting us down. I know from speaking to people at OTA that they are looking, and other organizations, at strategic litigation to force service delivery. We may see a lot more of attachment of council vehicles and property and furniture and computers if the municipality doesn't do, and its employees don't do, the bare minimum of their job. So there are initiatives to force government to do the jobs that they should be doing anyway, and while that's not ideal, at least that's a move in the right direction. On our side, we're going to try and continue to play our part to create this public good, to highlight and illuminate what's happening on a daily basis in a real-time situation, so that anyone who wants to know what's going on in their metro can read and can identify which parties are actually involved and interested in service delivery, and which parties are making excuses to not do their jobs. And we don't, Heidi, we don't have access in preparing the MetroMonitor to any inside information. Most of the work done for the MetroMonitor is looking at popular media, print media, television, the party's own websites and social media accounts, and reporting on what's happening. So if we can say that the city was already beginning to fail, and service delivery and finances in Joburg were failing October, November, December, January, you cannot believe parties in the government, the so-called coalition of local unity, the government of national unity, that includes the ANC, the EFF Patriotic Alliance, when they tell you they didn't know what's going on. Mm. The national provincial elections are a year away. We're going to keep hammering home the point, and we like to force the parties to take accountability or get punished at the polls. And I personally hope this will happen to parties that are running Joburg into the ground, because for me, as a Joburg boy, it's very personal.
I was actually going to ask you, Paul, if voters should not be looking at all of this, because just the other day on eNCA, we had a focus called Does My City Work? And I was here in the city of Johannesburg, and I couldn't find one thing that was positive. The streets were an absolute mess. You know, there's just lack of service delivery. And often you ask yourself as a voter, what am I actually looking for when I vote? And this is the concerning thing here, is that oftentimes the power does lie in the hands of the voter. Next year's elections, should we be looking at this? Should we be focusing and really thinking about who we are voting for?
Heidi, part of the work we want to do in the lead up to 2024 is to draw the links between what's been happening since November 2021, particularly in the metros, and the manifestos and positions of the different parties, so that voters can make a more informed choice. Most of our work, most of our research work, not our advocacy or our action work, is around educating and simplifying very complicated stories that are going on in the metros. So we hope to bring that to you, and I hope to speak to you sometime in the future and tell you about our 2024.
I'm sure we will speak to you. Thank you so much for your insights this evening. We do appreciate it. That was Paul Berkowitz from the Third Republic. And I think we are in for a really rough ride, especially because of the state of many of our metros, because of this leadership instability that we are seeing.